They don't warn you about the rules in the job description. That was the first thought that crossed my mind as I stared at the list taped to the lifeguard station. Written in faded marker on a worn sheet of laminated paper, the rules were strange enough to make me laugh, at least at first. The Greywater Community Center pool had been open since the 1960s, and it looked every bit its age. The walls were painted a sickly, faded turquoise, and the tiles lining the pool deck were cracked and yellowed. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, flickering just often enough to make you wonder if the building was falling apart. And yet, here I was. The job had sounded simple enough when I applied, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., sitting at the lifeguard station, keeping an eye on the pool to make sure no one snuck in. It was the kind of job nobody wanted, but one I couldn't afford to pass up. It paid well for a small-town gig, and more importantly, it gave me the solitude I'd been craving. After everything that had happened back home, the thought of sitting in a quiet, empty building sounded like exactly what I needed. That's how I justified it to myself, anyway. The truth was, I didn't have a lot of options. College hadn't worked out, and I was tired of feeling like I was drifting. When I walked into the pool for my first shift, the manager, Hank, greeted me with a curt nod. He was a wiry man in his late 50s, with sharp features and a voice like gravel. He handed me a set of keys, gave me a quick tour of the facility, and left me with a single piece of advice. Follow the rules, and you'll make it through the night. I had laughed at the time, thinking he meant the usual safety guidelines. But when I reached the lifeguard station and found the list taped to the wall, I realized he wasn't joking. The rules read: Rule number 1, don't go inside the pool at 1 a.m. Rule number 2, if you hear splashing but the water is still, do not investigate. Rule number 3, if a child asks for help but no one is there, leave immediately. Rule number 4, do not clean the deep end alone after midnight. Rule number 5, if you see someone standing on the high dive, do not speak to them. I frowned, rereading the list. It didn't make sense. I mean, some of them could be chalked up to weird safety precautions, but what was the deal with the child asking for help? Or the high dive? I shook my head, chuckling under my breath. It had to be a joke, some kind of hazing ritual for new hires. Good one, Hank, I muttered, tossing my bag onto the station chair. The first hour passed uneventfully. The building was as quiet as a tomb, save for the faint hum of the lights and the soft sound of water lapping against the sides of the pool. I sat at the lifeguard station, my feet propped up on the chair in front of me, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. It wasn't a bad gig, really. The place smelled strongly of chlorine and mildew, but the air was cool, and the dim lighting gave it a strange kind of peace. But the peace didn't last. Around 11:30 p.m., I heard it, the faint sound of splashing. I glanced up from my phone, my gaze sweeping over the pool. The surface of the water was perfectly still, the pale light reflecting off its surface like glass. Frowning, I stood and stepped closer to the edge. The sound grew louder, echoing through the empty room. Hello? I called, my voice breaking the silence. No response. The splashing stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the faint hum of the lights. I scanned the water, searching for any sign of movement, but it was as still as ever. My chest tightened. It was probably just the old pipes acting up, I told myself. The building was ancient, after all. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When Hank returned the next morning to lock up, I told him about the splashing. He listened quietly, his expression unreadable. Did you investigate? No, I said. The water was still, like you said in the rules. Hank nodded slowly. Good. Keep it that way. I frowned. What happens if I don't? He didn't answer. Instead, he patted my shoulder and handed me a thermos of coffee. You'll figure it out soon enough. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the splashing. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again, louder and more insistent, like something was thrashing just beneath the surface. The rules were still taped to the wall, their faded letters taunting me, Rule number 1, don't go inside the pool at 1 a.m. Rule number 2, if you hear splashing but the water is still, do not investigate. What was Hank trying to hide? As the hours passed, the building seemed to grow colder. The air felt heavier, pressing down on me like a damp blanket. I caught myself glancing toward the pool more often than I cared to admit, watching for the slightest ripple or movement. But the water remained still, its dark surface reflecting the flickering lights overhead. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When my shift finally ended, I practically sprinted to my car. The rising sun painted the sky in soft hues of orange and pink, but the chill in my chest didn't fade. As I drove home, I replayed the events of the night in my mind. The splashing, the silence, the rules, none of it made sense. But one thing was clear, this job wasn't going to be as simple as I'd thought. By the time I arrived for my second shift, the unease from the night before hadn't faded. The memory of the splashing haunted me. I told myself it was nothing, just the sound of the old pipes or maybe even my imagination. But no matter how much I rationalized, the feeling of being watched lingered. Hank didn't stick around to chat this time. He handed me the keys, gave me his usual nod, and left without a word. As the heavy doors swung shut behind him, the silence of the building wrapped around me like a cold blanket. The rules were still taped to the lifeguard station, their faded letters mocking me. Don't go inside the pool at 1 a.m. If you hear splashing but the water is still, do not investigate. I stared at Rule 2 for a long moment, the words blurring together as my stomach churned. It didn't take long for the sounds to return. It was around midnight when I heard it again, the faint sound of splashing, echoing through the stillness of the pool. This time, I froze. My fingers tightened around the flashlight I'd been holding, my pulse quickening. Not again, I muttered. The sound was soft at first, like someone paddling lazily through the water. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder, more erratic, like someone was thrashing violently. I stood from the lifeguard station, my legs shaky. The flashlight beam trembled as I shone it across the pool deck. The water was perfectly still. I paced the edge of the pool, my flashlight scanning the surface for any signs of movement. The sound continued, loud and insistent, but the water didn't so much as ripple. Every instinct told me to stay put, to follow the rule and let it be. But my curiosity gnawed me, growing stronger with each passing second. What if it was real this time? What if someone had snuck into the building? What if? I stopped myself, shaking my head. There's no one here, I whispered. But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer to the edge of the pool. The flashlight beam danced across the water, illuminating the tiles beneath the surface. Everything looked normal, except for the deep end. The light didn't reach it. The water in the deep end was darker, like ink had seeped into it, swallowing the light whole. I leaned forward, squinting into the blackness. That's when I saw it. A shadow, faint and flickering, moving beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection or a clump of algae drifting through the water. But as I watched, the shadow grew sharper, more distinct. It moved with purpose, gliding just beneath the surface like a predator stalking its prey. The splashing stopped abruptly. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. And then it rose. The shadow moved toward the surface, its form becoming clearer with each passing second. It wasn't human. Its limbs were long and angular, bending in ways that made my stomach churn. Its head was featureless, just a smooth, dark oval that reflected the flashlight's beam. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my grip and clattering onto the tiles. The beam flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. When I looked back at the pool, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Even after Hank returned in the morning and locked up the building, the image of the shadowy figure stayed with me. I told him what I'd seen, my voice trembling. I told you not to investigate, he said, shaking his head. You're lucky it didn't pull you in. Pull me in? I asked, my stomach twisting. What the hell is that thing? Hank didn't answer. He just handed me my bag and muttered, "Follow the rules, Alex. That's all you need to know." That night, I dreamed of drowning. I was back at the pool, standing at the edge of the deep end. The water was dark and still, the air heavy with chlorine. A faint splash broke the silence, and before I could react, something grabbed my ankles and dragged me under. The water was icy, seeping into my lungs as I thrashed and screamed. I could feel it, cold, bony fingers wrapping around my limbs, pulling me deeper into the abyss. When I woke, I was gasping for air, my chest heaving. My sheets were damp with sweat, and my throat burned like I'd been holding my breath for hours. Over the next few nights, the signs grew harder to ignore. It started with wet footprints. I'd find them on the pool deck in the mornings, leading from the deep end to the lifeguard station. They were small, like a child's, and always stopped abruptly, as if whoever had left them had vanished into thin air. Then came the laughter. Faint and echoing, it drifted through the building late at night, bouncing off the walls. It sounded like a child playing, their giggles high-pitched and carefree. But there was no one there. The final straw came a week later. I was sitting at the lifeguard station, trying to distract myself with a book, when I heard a faint creak. I looked up, and my blood ran cold. The high dive was moving. It swayed gently, as if someone had just climbed onto it and jumped into the pool. But the water below was undisturbed, its surface still and silent. I shone my flashlight toward the high dive, my hands trembling. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing there, a small, pale shape with hollow eyes. And then it was gone. By the time my shift ended, I was a mess. My hands shook as I handed Hank the keys, my voice cracking as I asked him for answers. "You're starting to see it now," he said, his tone grim. "See what?" I demanded. Hank hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the pool. "The water remembers," he said finally. "It remembers everyone it's taken. And if you're not careful, it'll take you too." I couldn't let it go. The shadow beneath the water, the childlike laughter, the wet footprints, none of it made sense. But the one thing I knew for sure was that the pool wasn't just some decrepit community facility. There was something wrong with it, something that felt older and far more dangerous than anything I'd ever experienced. Hank's words echoed in my mind, "The water remembers." What did he mean by that? The first person I talked to was Mara, a part-time janitor who worked at the Greywater Community Center during the day. She was younger than Hank, probably in her late 40s, with graying hair pulled back into a ponytail and a no-nonsense demeanor. I caught her just as she was finishing up her shift, leaning against her cart of cleaning supplies. "Hey, Mara," I said, trying to sound casual. "You've worked here a while, right?" She eyed me warily. "Long enough." "Why? Have you ever noticed anything weird about the pool?" Her expression darkened. "What did you hear?" "Not hear," I said quickly. "More like see or feel." Mara let out a sharp breath, glancing toward the pool. "You mean the noises? The laughter? The shadows in the deep end?" A chill ran down my spine. "So you know about it?" "Everybody does," she said. "You think anyone sticks around here for the pay?" "What's causing it?" I asked. Mara shook her head. "All I know is, that pool's got history. Bad history. You want to know more, you'll need to dig for it yourself." The next morning, I drove to the town library. It wasn't much, a squat, brick building with creaky floors and rows of dusty shelves, but it had an archive room in the basement. I explained to the librarian that I was researching the history of the community center for a project, and she led me to a dimly lit room filled with old newspapers and filing cabinets. "Good luck," she said, her voice tinged with skepticism. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but after an hour of flipping through yellowed clippings, I found it, a headline from 1962. The article detailed the drowning of an 8-year-old boy named Peter Hargrove during a swim lesson. According to witnesses, Peter had been in the shallow end when he suddenly disappeared beneath the surface. Several people jumped in to save him, but when they pulled him out, he was already gone. The part that made my stomach turn was a single line buried near the end of the article. Witnesses claim they saw something pulling the boy down, though no one could explain what it was. Once I found the first story, the rest came quickly. In 1974, a lifeguard quit after claiming to see a shadowy figure standing at the bottom of the deep end during her shift. No one else saw it, but she refused to return to the pool. In 1982, a janitor named Carl Everett disappeared while cleaning the pool late at night. His tools were found neatly arranged on the pool deck, but his body was never recovered. In 1995, an entire swim team reported hearing laughter echoing through the pool during practice. When they checked the locker rooms, they found wet footprints leading into the showers, but no one was there. Every story followed the same pattern: strange noises, shadows in the water, and people disappearing without a trace. I returned to the pool that night with a stack of printouts and a knot in my stomach. When Hank arrived at the end of my shift, I cornered him before he could leave. "What aren't you telling me?" I demanded, holding up the clippings. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I told you to follow the rules. That's all you need to know." "That's not good enough," I snapped. "What's happening in this pool? Why are people disappearing?" Hank hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the water. "This place isn't just a pool, Alex. It's something else. Something old." "What does that mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the list of rules. "You don't need to understand it. You just need to survive." After Hank left, I stayed behind, staring at the water. Something old. Something that remembers. I couldn't stop thinking about the idea of the pool being alive in some way. Not alive like a person or an animal, but something bigger, something that fed on fear, on the people who broke the rules. But why? The more I thought about it, the more the pool felt like a trap. The rules weren't just there to keep us safe. They were there to keep the pool fed. Over the next few nights, the signs grew more intense. The laughter became louder, echoing through the empty building no matter where I was. I started hearing faint whispers, too soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the water itself. The shadows in the deep end became more frequent, flickering beneath the surface like smoke. And then, one night, I saw the high dive move again. It was 2 a.m. when I heard the faint creak of the high dive. I froze, my heart pounding, as I turned toward the sound. A figure stood at the top of the platform, its form pale and indistinct. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, just stood there, staring down at the water. I knew the rule. If you see someone standing on the high dive, do not speak to them. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay silent. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if it were watching me. Then, without warning, it stepped off the platform and disappeared into the water. The splash echoed through the room, but when I looked, the pool was empty. I spent the rest of the night pacing the pool deck, trying to make sense of everything I'd learned. The rules weren't random, they were tied to specific events, each one connected to a disappearance or a sighting. Rule 2 was about Peter Hargrove, the boy who drowned in 1962. Rule 4 was tied to Carl Everett, the janitor who vanished in 1982. And Rule 5, the high dive, was linked to the lifeguard who quit in 1974. The pool wasn't just haunted. It was a cycle, repeating the same tragedies over and over again. And I was trapped in the middle of it. I didn't want to break another rule. After everything I'd seen, everything I'd read about the pool, I knew better. The rules weren't there as a joke or some hazing ritual. They were survival instructions, a fragile barrier between me and whatever haunted the water. But that night, the pool didn't give me a choice. It was nearly midnight when I heard it, a faint voice echoing through the building. "Help." The cry was high-pitched and trembling, like a child in pain. My stomach twisted as I froze at the lifeguard station, the list of rules catching my eye. Rule 3, If a child asks for help but no one is there, leave immediately. The voice came again, louder this time. Please. Help me. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the desk. I knew the rule. I knew I should grab my keys, lock the doors, and leave without looking back. But I couldn't move. The voice sounded so real, so desperate. I thought of Peter Hargrove, the boy who drowned in the 1960s. Was it him? Was he trapped somehow, waiting for someone to save him? Or was it something else, something pretending to be him? Hello? I called, my voice shaky. The cry came again, this time from the deep end of the pool. I grabbed my flashlight and stood, my legs unsteady as I approached the edge. The water was unnaturally still, its surface dark and glassy. Who's there? I called, my voice echoing off the damp walls. Help me, the voice pleaded, more urgent now. I shone my flashlight across the pool, my breath catching in my throat. In the deep end, something broke the surface. It was a hand. The hand was small and pale, splashing weakly as if it belonged to someone struggling to stay afloat. Help, the voice screamed again, more desperate than ever. I hesitated, my heart pounding. Everything about this felt wrong. The water wasn't rippling the way it should, and the hand moved with an eerie, mechanical precision. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I dropped the flashlight and dove into the water. The cold hit me like a wall, stealing the breath from my lungs. It was colder than it should have been, freezing and heavy, wrapping around me like a living thing. I swam toward the deep end, my limbs sluggish and numb. The hand was still there, thrashing weakly just beneath the surface. I've got you. I gasped, reaching out. The moment my fingers touched the hand, it disappeared. Something grabbed my ankle. It was strong and cold, its grip like iron as it dragged me beneath the surface. I thrashed and kicked, panic surging through me as the water closed over my head. The pool seemed deeper than it should have been, the bottom nowhere in sight. The dim light from the surface grew faint as I was pulled down into the dark. I screamed, but the water filled my lungs, choking me. In the depths of the pool, I saw it. The shadow I'd glimpsed before, the one that moved beneath the surface, was all around me now. Its form was massive and shifting, like smoke trapped in water. It didn't have a face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unrelenting. Its limbs, long and angular, wrapped around me, pulling me closer. I felt something brush against my cheek, like a hand or a claw. It wasn't just pulling me under, it was trying to keep me. Desperation took over. I kicked and thrashed with all my strength, clawing at the water as I fought to break free. The shadow tightened its grip, but I managed to slip out of its grasp, my lungs burning as I swam toward the faint light above. When I broke the surface, I gasped for air, coughing and sputtering as I clawed my way to the edge of the pool. I collapsed onto the tiles, shivering and soaked, my heart racing. For a long moment, I lay there, staring at the ceiling as the adrenaline drained from my body. When I finally sat up, I noticed the bruises. Dark, finger-shaped marks circled my wrists and ankles, like something had been holding me down. The pool was silent, its surface still and unbroken. Whatever had pulled me under was gone, for now. The next morning, I confronted Hank as soon as he arrived. "What the hell is in that pool?" I demanded, my voice shaking. I saw something. It grabbed me, tried to drown me. Hank's face paled. "You broke Rule 3, didn't you?" "It was a kid." I shouted. I heard him screaming for help. What was I supposed to do? "You were supposed to leave," Hank said sharply. "It wasn't a kid, Alex. It was the pool." I stared at him, my stomach twisting. "What do you mean, the pool?" He hesitated, running a hand through his thinning hair. "It's not just haunted. It's alive. It wants you to break the rules. That's how it gets you." Hank's words echoed in my mind as I drove home that morning. The pool wanted me. It wasn't just a passive force, a collection of restless spirits tied to the water. It was something bigger, something malevolent. And it wasn't going to stop until it had me. Over the next few nights, the bruises on my wrists and ankles didn't fade. If anything, they grew darker, the shapes more distinct. The nightmares returned, worse than ever. I dreamed of drowning, of cold hands dragging me into the dark, of voices whispering my name. And every time I woke up, I swore I could hear the faint sound of splashing, even in my own apartment. I couldn't keep going like this. The pool was getting stronger, its presence bleeding into every part of my life. If I didn't do something, I knew it would win. I needed answers. I needed to find out how to stop it. The pool was alive. It wasn't just some haunted relic of the past. It had a will of its own, a hunger. The shadows, the laughter, the figure in the deep end, they weren't random occurrences. They were all part of something larger, something I was only beginning to understand. I needed answers. But the only way to get them was to break another rule. It happened on a Thursday night. The building was even quieter than usual, the flickering lights casting long, eerie shadows across the tiles. Rule 4 had been gnawing at the back of my mind for days. Do not clean the deep end alone after midnight. I didn't have a choice. I waited until the clock struck 12:01, then grabbed the long pool brush from the storage closet. The handle felt cold and heavy in my hands as I approached the edge of the pool. The deep end stared back at me, its water dark and still. As soon as the brush touched the water, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I shivered, gripping the handle tighter as I began scrubbing the tiles at the edge of the pool. The brush moved easily over the shallow end, sweeping away grime and algae. But as I pushed it toward the deep end, the water resisted, dragging the brush down like it was caught in a current. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of chlorine and mildew. I glanced around, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from before, but the pool deck was empty. For now. The deeper I scrubbed, the stranger things became. At first, it was just the resistance, the way the water seemed to fight me, pulling the brush away from the tiles. But then I noticed the marks. Etched into the tiles at the bottom of the deep end were strange, angular symbols. They glowed faintly, their edges shimmering like they were carved from molten metal. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the surface of the water. "What the hell is this?" I muttered. The symbols formed a circle, their lines sharp and precise, almost like runes. They pulsed faintly, in rhythm with the pounding of my heart. As I stared at the symbols, the water began to ripple. It started small, a faint disturbance near the center of the deep end. But the ripples grew larger, spreading outward in perfect concentric circles. I dropped the brush, backing away from the edge. The water grew darker, the light from the overhead fluorescence swallowed by the shadows pooling beneath the surface. And then it rose. The figure I'd seen before, the one that haunted my nightmares, emerged from the water. It was humanoid, but barely. Its limbs were impossibly long, bending at unnatural angles. Its head was smooth and featureless, reflecting the faint glow of the symbols beneath it. The air seemed to hum with its presence, a low, vibrating sound that made my teeth ache. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. I could feel its intent, cold and malevolent, pressing down on me like a physical weight. The figure began to move, gliding toward the edge of the pool without disturbing the water. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying me. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The brush was still floating near the deep end, but I didn't dare reach for it. The figure stopped just below the surface, its form flickering like a dying flame. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged toward me. I screamed, scrambling away from the edge as the figure's long, claw-like hand broke the surface. It swiped at the tiles, inches from my foot, before retreating back into the water. The ripples grew violent, the pool churning as if something massive was thrashing beneath the surface. I bolted for the lifeguard station, my heart racing. When I reached the station, I grabbed the flashlight with shaking hands and shone it back toward the pool. The water was still again, its surface smooth and reflective. But the wet footprints were back. They led from the deep end to the station, stopping just short of my chair. I scanned the room, the flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the darkness. There was no one there. The next day, I searched the storage room for anything that might explain what I'd seen. Behind a stack of old towels and cleaning supplies, I found it, a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The name on the inside cover was scrawled in shaky handwriting, Carl Everett. The janitor who disappeared in 1982. The deep end isn't normal. There's something there, something that watches me when I clean. I found the symbols today. I tried scrubbing them off, but they just keep coming back. I think they're part of the pool, like they've always been there. It doesn't like the rules. It wants me to break them. Every time I clean, it gets closer. I don't know how much longer I can do this. If anyone finds this, stay away from the deep end. Don't clean it. Don't look at it. Don't let it take you. The journal confirmed what I already knew. The pool wasn't just haunted. It was cursed. The symbols were part of the curse, a way of containing whatever malevolent force lurked in the deep end. But the more I interacted with it, the stronger it became. Hank found me reading the journal that evening. "You shouldn't have touched it," he said, his voice low. I needed to know. I shot back. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" Hank sighed, rubbing his temples. "Because knowing doesn't help. The more you think about it, the more it gets inside your head. That's what it wants." I couldn't ignore the pool anymore. It was alive, feeding on the fear and confusion of anyone who broke the rules. And now that I'd seen the symbols, felt the figure's presence, I knew it wouldn't let me go. The rules weren't just a warning, they were a challenge. And I'd broken too many of them. The pool wasn't going to stop. It was in the water, in the shadows, in my mind. The symbols etched into the bottom of the deep end, the wet footprints, the whispers, they were all part of it, all connected to something ancient and alive. And now, it was coming for me. Carl Everett's journal wasn't just a warning. Hidden among the frantic entries and cryptic notes was a passage about a ritual. According to Carl, it wasn't a way to destroy the entity, but to contain it, to trap it within the pool's boundaries. The instructions were vague and scattered across several pages, but the core elements were clear. Perform the ritual at 1 a.m., the time when the pool was most active. Use an offering tied to guilt or loss, something personal to appease the entity. Recite the symbols etched into the bottom of the deep end. The thought of facing the pool at its strongest made my blood run cold. But if I didn't do something, I knew it would consume me. I spent the rest of the day gathering what I needed. The offering was the hardest part. I searched my apartment for something meaningful, something tied to the guilt I'd carried for years. I found it in an old shoebox, a waterlogged photograph of my best friend, Tyler. Tyler had been my best friend since we were kids. He was the one who dared me to jump into the deep end of the local pool when we were 9. I'd done it, laughing as I surfaced, but when Tyler jumped after me, something went wrong. I'll never forget the way he thrashed, the way his hand reached for mine as he slipped beneath the surface. I froze. I didn't pull him out. By the time someone else dove in to save him, it was too late. I'd lived with that guilt ever since, the memory of his hand outstretched in the water haunting me. Now, I held the photo tightly, the edges warped and curling from years of neglect. When the clock struck 12:45 a.m., I drove to the pool. The building was eerily silent, the air thick with the smell of chlorine and mildew. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long shadows across the tiles, making the entire space feel alive. The rules were still taped to the lifeguard station, their faded letters catching my eye. Don't go inside the pool at 1 a.m. I stared at the rule for a long moment, my chest tight. Then I slipped the photograph into my pocket and stepped toward the water. The deep end looked darker than ever, the glowing symbols at the bottom faintly pulsing like a heartbeat. I knelt at the edge, clutching the photograph. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest as I whispered a quiet apology to Tyler. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. Then I let the photo fall. It drifted through the water, sinking slowly until it reached the glowing circle of symbols at the bottom. The moment it touched the tiles, the pool came alive. The water rippled violently, churning as if something massive was rising from the depths. The lights overhead flickered wildly, casting the room in alternating flashes of blinding brightness and pitch-black shadow. And then I saw it. The entity rose from the center of the deep end, its form towering and monstrous. Its limbs were long and angular, bending in ways that defied logic. Its face, or what passed for a face, was featureless, a smooth expanse of black that reflected nothing. The air hummed with its presence, a low, vibrating sound that filled my ears and made my teeth ache. I clutched Carl's journal tightly, my fingers trembling as I flipped to the page with the symbols. The words were jagged and foreign, their shapes twisting on the paper as if they were alive. I took a deep breath and began to read aloud. The entity reacted immediately. The water surged toward me, icy tendrils lashing out as if trying to pull me into the pool. I stumbled backward, barely avoiding their grasp, and continued to chant the symbols. The runes etched into the tiles glowed brighter with each word, their light pulsing in time with my heartbeat. The entity roared, a deafening sound that shook the walls and rattled the windows. As I recited the final symbol, the entity faltered. Its form flickered like a dying flame, its limbs retracting as if in pain. The water grew still, the oppressive weight in the air lifting slightly. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then the entity surged forward, its claws slicing through the air as it lunged toward me. Before I could react, the entity's tendrils wrapped around my ankle, yanking me into the pool. The water closed over my head, freezing and suffocating as the shadows engulfed me. I fought to the surface, thrashing against the entity's grip, but it was too strong. I was pulled deeper and deeper, the light above fading until I was surrounded by total darkness. The shadows pressed against me, their cold, bony fingers wrapping around my limbs. In the distance, I heard voices, faint, echoing whispers that grew louder with each passing second. "Help us. Don't let it take you." The voices belonged to the ones the pool had claimed. Desperation took over. I clutched the journal, its pages dissolving in the water, and screamed the last of the symbols. The glowing runes at the bottom of the pool flared brighter than ever, their light cutting through the darkness. The entity roared in pain, its grip loosening as the water around me began to boil. With one final surge of strength, I kicked free and swam toward the surface. I broke the surface with a gasp, coughing and sputtering as I clawed my way to the edge of the pool. The water was still again, the symbols at the bottom fading into nothingness. But the entity was gone. I collapsed onto the tiles, my body trembling as the weight of what had happened sank in. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence that had haunted the pool finally lifted. But I knew it wasn't over. The pool wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. And curses don't break easily. The water was still. For the first time since I'd started working at the Greywater pool, the air felt normal, clean, even. The oppressive weight that had clung to every surface was gone, replaced by an almost eerie calm. I sat on the cold tiles, my legs dangling over the edge of the pool, trying to process what had just happened. I had done it. The ritual had worked. But I didn't feel safe. I glanced at the deep end, half expecting the runes at the bottom to flare to life again, but they were gone. The pool looked ordinary. But I knew better. The voices I'd heard in the void, the cold hands pulling at me, they weren't gone. They were waiting. And the pool was waiting, too. When Hank arrived that morning, he stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes scanning the room like he was expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. "You look like hell," he said, his voice low. "I did it," I said, my voice hoarse. "The ritual. The pool, it's quiet now." Hank's face darkened. He didn't look relieved. "You think you stopped it?" he asked, shaking his head. "You didn't stop anything. You just bought yourself some time." I stared at him, my stomach twisting. "What do you mean?" Hank sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The pool's been here longer than any of us. You can't beat it, Alex. You can't get rid of it. All you can do is keep it contained. Follow the rules, keep your head down, and hope it doesn't come after you. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I looked back at the pool. The high dive stood tall and silent, its metal frame gleaming faintly in the morning light. A shadow flickered at the top, a faint, human-like shape. I blinked, and it was gone. I quit that day. I couldn't stay, not after everything I'd seen. The pool had taken enough from me. But as I packed my things and drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The pool had a way of pulling people back, of keeping them tied to it. For weeks, I tried to move on. I took a job at a diner on the edge of town, rented a new apartment, and avoided anything that reminded me of water. But the dreams didn't stop. Every night, I found myself standing at the edge of the pool, staring into the dark water as the shadows reached for me. And every morning, I woke up gasping for air, my wrists aching as if something had been holding me down. A month after I left, I found myself back at the graywater pool. I don't know what drew me there, curiosity, guilt, or something else entirely. But as I stood outside the building, staring at the flickering, "Closed for repairs" sign, I knew I couldn't stay away. The water remembers. Hank's words echoed in my mind as I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The pool was quiet, its surface smooth and reflective. The air was cold, but not oppressive. For a moment, I thought everything might be okay. Then I saw it. The shadow. It was standing at the edge of the deep end, its form faint but unmistakable. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were watching me. The runes at the bottom of the pool flared to life, their glow pulsing faintly in the dark. I felt a chill run down my spine as the shadow stepped forward, its long, angular limbs reaching toward me. I didn't run. Instead, I took a step closer, my chest tight with fear and defiance. The shadow stopped, its form flickering like a dying flame. For a moment, we stared at each other, the silence between us heavy with unspoken understanding. Then, slowly, the shadow sank back into the water, its presence dissolving into the stillness. The pool was quiet again. But I knew it was only a matter of time.